Hi, welcome to another edition of 1 in 15. As ever, I'm going to let my guest introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Tim Evans. I live in the east part of Birmingham, on an estate there. My job is that I work for an organisation called Worth Unlimited. I was the chief executive. I'm now director of strategy and vision, grand sounding title, helping us think about what our work with young people and work with communities, in particular those that experience kind of disadvantage and vulnerability, what our work should look like in the future. So that's
Brilliant.
kind of what I do.
That's really great, Tim. And I know you fairly well, so I know you've got like a comprehensive brief beyond that as well. So tell me about one thing that's been kind of dominating your thinking or your practice over the last couple of months as we've had this slightly surreal situation going on.
Yeah, I think the thing that has been most on my mind is a question actually that I have been asking of myself and asking of other people as we think about how to navigate our way kind of through this crisis
Sure.
and what coming out the other side looks like. So the question I've been asking is, what have we been noticing? So what have we noticed about ourselves? What have we noticed about the world that young people inhabit? What have we noticed about our ways of working? What have we noticed about the world? And if you're a person of faith, what have we noticed about God or our faith during this time?
Sure. And I love that because that's beautifully broad and deep and wide and narrow. So, I mean, what stands out? What are some of those things that you've noticed, and what is the impact on the work
Yeah,
now and the work as you see it going forward?
yeah, I think so. I think like a really common thing, I think, has been the conversations around what do we value, what do we think is important.
Sure.
Um, so the obvious things are we've noticed that the people who've got us through this pandemic are not famous pop stars or athletes or whatever,
Yeah.
but people who work in shops, nurses, doctors, bin men,
Yeah.
shopkeepers. We've noticed who's important, I think, and who, when push comes to shove, who holds us all together, I
Yeah.
think. So that would be one important thing, I think, about what do we value about ourselves, what do we value about our relationships, what do we value about the world around us, what really makes the world meaningful and compassionate.
Yeah.
What is all of that? So I think that's been an important thing, and I think identity would probably be another one of. Certainly speaking for myself, our identity can get caught up in the work that we do, the way we interact with the world, the things that are important to
Sure.
us, the ways that we do things, and that's been interrupted largely during this time. And so when your identity is no longer in the ways that you did things before, what does that say for you about yourself? What does that say for other people? Like, etc. So probably those two things. There's a whole bunch of practical layering to that, but those two conceptual things, I think, have been the things that I've been thinking most about.
Okay. And as you say, they are very broad, and but important. That important that I'm reminded of a story in the Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy years ago where there was a planet on destruction, and they formed up 3 different groups of people to fly to a brave new planet. And to cut a long story short, one of the groups was people who weren't regarded. They were hairdressers and telephone sanitizers and things like that. And their plane actually was abandoned and their ship wasn't taken to the new world. But then what happened on the new world was that there was a virus that wiped them out that came from a dirty telephone. It's this kind of thing of the things that we take for granted, the roles that we take for granted, even within ourselves. Those of us who have got children at home, home education's become a new role that we've done on the cuff, but we've absolutely all of us probably taken teachers for granted to some extent, and now we've got a new respect for them, at least in the short term. It'll be interesting to see when schools return to something more like what it used to be, how long we sustain that kind of. I now notice, how long the clapping for the NHS thing is interesting as well, isn't it? Everyone was doing that enthusiastically, and now that enthusiasm seems to have waned to some extent. How long will that, and the clapping doesn't translate into money or hospital beds. So it's like that. That's really interesting. So in terms of perhaps in terms of your role with Worth Unlimited, where is some of those reflections taking you in terms of how do you think you might do things differently or reevaluate things that you've already done going forward?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things. So I'm really a fan of naming things. So I think helping our teams and our volunteers and young people that we work with
Sure.
name what's happened to them. Because I think naming is a way that you hold on to something, a way that you kind of articulate that something is either important to you, you've noticed during this time that's been like a positive step, but also things that you, to use the theological phrase, that you might lament. So if you've missed being connected to other people, naming that. If you've noticed that actually you've got to know your neighbour 2 doors down because you both clapped for the NHS on a Thursday, is noticing how that relationship and noticing the importance of that connection, and then holding that kind of going forward. So I think there's something about the way that we see the world. How do we help in a more tangible way ourselves kind of take notice of that? But then I think there's obviously practical things like, in our work, we obviously have, we've stopped running sessions where young people come together. And so all of that physical proximity that's so important to the kind of work that we do has been lost. And I think, we've tried to be creative around that. So online youth work, doorstep conversations, wellbeing and activity packs for young people. So actually, what are the things that young people and our teams have valued during that? Has it enabled them to build new connections? Has it enabled them to do relationships a bit differently? Has it enabled them to get to know some different young people? Have young people who maybe wouldn't come along to, say, a youth club, for example, but actually have really enjoyed having a youth worker knock their door, step back to the edge of the drive, them sit on the doorstep and have a conversation. Like for some young people, that might actually be a very valuable interaction that they never would have done with a youth worker, otherwise. So there's some practical things that maybe we've seen that we want to keep going with. But like I say, also recognizing that our work is in essence is relational work, and seeing that human beings flourish when they're in relationships with each other. And as a Christian, I would say relationships with God, with each other, and with place and the creation. Like that's what we would call shalom, which is the basis of the organization's kind of thinking. And actually, when you can't do that connectivity in the same way, are there different ways you can do that? But also, what have you missed about all of that? And how do you continue to name that so that actually you see relationships as being the lifeblood of what it means to flourish as a human being? And that actually, for young people who might be caught up in actually it's about being famous or being successful or making lots of money or doing a certain kind of job or whatever. Not that some of those things are not unimportant, but actually going, when you stripped all that away, what have you really needed in the time of real crisis? And maybe what you've needed is family, friends, other adults, connections with other people. Well, actually, if that's a building block of human flourishing, then here's a chance to hang on to that and maybe rethink about how you do life and do work with people. That really builds upon that ability for people to flourish. Because I think that's what the pandemic has done, is interrupted all of those other things that give us value and identity, and has made us strip ourselves back to what are the things that really are important. And it's so easy to go. One of the other things I've been thinking about is this term new normal, that if we just go back to a normal that says, well, that was what we did in the emergency, that's what got us through that, but actually we're going to go back to a way of being in the world that buys into all that other stuff as being the most important thing, then actually I think that's an opportunity lost to think differently.
I love that. I mean, I think that concept of naming things, I'm down with that. I think that's really important. And this idea of holding the two, if I may say, kind of the two extremes in tension, the lamenting, the mourning on one side, and the celebrating on the other, and kind of admitting where things are perhaps quite surprising things. So I was chatting to another youth worker recently who was saying that relationships like yours, that project is so centered on relationships, and some of the key ways that they've celebrated and would choose to re-celebrate and participate in relationship going forward have just had to stop, or they've had to be radically altered. But they've also noticed new dimensions. So that, funny enough, they were talking about kind of doorstep youth work, and this, some of those examples where suddenly the youth worker and the parent and the young person are in a relationship, which may never have happened before, or certainly not happened in the same way. And so trying to work out, well, how do we keep the space appropriate for being first and foremost for the young person and for their experience and safety and so on, but how do we celebrate the involvement in a parent who perhaps didn't know anything about the youth work project or didn't know anything about that side of their young person, is really interesting. And equally, I've had conversations with my own children or with children's friends about their reappreciation and re-exaggeration of frustration of the role of their parents as they're stuck with them for the whole time. So I've got friends who suddenly their children actually understand what they do for a living because they've seen it, even if it's just you stare at a computer all day and do spreadsheets, like they've got a renewed understanding of it. And that for me, I think is going to be really interesting as we drift towards whatever, like I'm cautious about that new normal phrase, but whatever we land towards or whatever we start to, and I think it'll be quite a gradual thing. I think some things will return to familiarity quite quickly, and other things will probably never return to what we were used to before. But all of that, I think that filter, that lens of going, what can we celebrate here and retain, whether it's new or something that we've kind of taken for granted, but we need to re-emphasize. What can we celebrate? And also, what can we mourn? What can we mourn because actually we're never going to get it back? Or what can we appropriately mourn because we don't want it back? Or what can we, because we're mourning it so much, we know we need to re-engage with it in new ways? And that would be really interesting. But I think for a lot of people who work, I think for everyone, that naming, so going, we've all been through a trauma. We've all felt kind of low-level, non-clinical depression of some level. We've all had days where we've been flying. We've all had days where we've struggled. And admitting that, there's a real strength in community and going, actually, yeah, you've had that experience, not in exactly the same way, but we've shared those struggles. We've shared that, mourning of the things that we took for granted will be really interesting going forwards.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly. No, I think that's right. I think one of the other things that I've been thinking about is certainly here I live in Birmingham, and here in Birmingham, things like how we meet needs, like the big public sector and Quangos and big NGOs and all that kind of stuff have needed not just grassroots kind of organisations, although they've really needed those, but they've needed neighbour to neighbour support. Because they can't do it. And I think I will be interested about whether on a public policy level, there's an opportunity for public bodies to think about what they've noticed during this time. I as we know each other well, and I am always a proponent of the relationship between kind of people who need to take a strategic overview of a town or a city or a borough and what's going on there, with grassroots, embedded, local. And I think where it's worked, I suspect where we've observed that work well during this time is where that interaction has been a good one. And where actually each has seen the reliance on the other. So in Birmingham, we've needed central food distribution models, but to deliver those, we've needed neighbourliness and embeddedness and rootedness. And so my hope, I'm not sure how optimistic I am about this hope, but is also that, like I say, that in one sense at government and local authority level, that they notice what they've needed again during this time. And that actually, like I say, neighbourliness and grassroots and embeddedness in communities and in neighbourhoods that enable people to be neighbour to neighbour, as well as neighbours noticing their need for each other, would change the whole. I think that at the big picture, you would change the whole dynamic of how our society works, how decisions get made, etc. Because you would say the neighbourhood is the focus, the locus of when things are really up against it, of how people get through things. So that would be my other kind of bigger picture kind of reflection of what can public policy change during this time.
Yeah, and we're pretty much bang out of time. And normally I ask people at the end, you know, what is their hope? But that you've really articulated that clearly. I'm sure we've all got some kind of cautious hope about that, the capacity for the larger organising bodies and the local groups to effectively communicate to each other. But I think I share that hope, that kind of renewed understanding, hopefully not just temporary, that I need you and you need me. And you know, locally and more kind of nationally and internationally, that you know, let's pray, hope and pray that energy remains. Tim, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you ever so much for your time today, and we're confident that Worth Unlimited will continue to serve and help young people in their communities really, really well post pandemic and into the future. Bless you, mate.
Thank you for having me. Much appreciated.
Bye.